did my first VBA project. Now, I'm not going to recommend everybody learns VBA. If I'm honest, and talking to people in Excel, kind of how to grow in Excel, my recommendation is don't bother learning this. My recommendation as part of this presentation is just download the tool that Mike Barnes has built and do with it whatever you see fit. But it is built in VBA, which is why it's relevant to talking about here. Around 2018, I worked with some very good people in Excel, and one individual specifically in Alder Hey that started to teach me a lot more about Excel and how to use it efficiently. So whereas before I might have learned a lookup formula, and my lookup formula of choice might have been an index match, what I learned during around 2018 was actually there is a correct use case for a point in time. If I'm doing a lookup and it's looking within the data set to the right of it, a VLOOKUP's the best bet. I can use it over more rows. If I'm wanting it to be a bit more dynamic and maybe go to the left of the reference point, then I might use an index match. And if I want something truly dynamic, I'd go back to my index match formula. But again, it's not the most efficient, and it's probably better to use on a smaller data set. There's also things around Power Query and Power Pivot that I started to pick up at this point, which if you're looking down the innovation point, I'd certainly recommend looking at Power Query, Power Pivot as kind of soft introductions to where you can automate your processes and flows. If your trust allows it, that would lead you nicely onto Power Automate. Unfortunately, our trust doesn't allow it, which is why kind of this VBA route is quite powerful to us, but I'll allude more to that later on. And really, it was around this time that I started looking at, can I use VBA to execute SQL queries? So it wasn't until probably 2023 time that I was actually finally able to find a really good use case for this ability in VBA. And the use case became costing and validation, but actually there's so many things coming out of the woodwork that I can now use this tool for, the underlying principles for, to do whatever I want with. And I will start to kind of show some of those later on as well. And as I said before about VBA, wouldn't recommend necessarily learning it. And what took me several years to conceptualize and learn and code, actually a colleague of mine, once we knew this was possible, they could just put it into AI, Copilot, whatever, and it would spit out essentially the same VBA code that I had spent a long time learning, honing, yada, yada, yada. So please don't go learning VBA if you don't already know it. And if it's not something on your kind of PDR as next steps, but it's just to say the narrative that way back when I started learning it, it's a tool I'm very proficient in. So it's something that I've used in this use case. So I've got a methodology that allows me from Excel to execute SQL statements. So why have I chosen to use it in costing land? And the prime reason is that our system is so bespoke. Whereas other trusts might get their outputs that are submitted to the National Cost Collection given to them, there might be a separate tool that helps them download it. Ours doesn't. Ours is so bespoke that it's entirely on us that we need to create the CSVs, and we need to be the ones that check that and submit them. Going back to that check-in, some trusts will run. There is a national validation engine that NHS England run when you submit your files, but it takes a period of time to run. Some trusts have baked that, or some suppliers have baked that into their software. Again, ours is not baked into our software because it's so heavily bespoke. So that is entirely on us that before we submit, we don't know what the potential output of that national result is. And we kind of got a little bit stuck in 22-23. We were a relatively new team. First time running the system all the way through, first NCC of the system, and we hadn't left ourselves potentially enough time at the end. So we'd got our model complete, we were happy to submit the files, we uploaded them, and we came back with a whole bunch of warnings on that and submission failures that we didn't know were going to be generated. So we ended up in a crunch period that we needed to cram through, understand the warnings, and correct any of the submission failures in a tight turnaround period. Our solution was that we wanted to bake in these national rules into our kind of business as usual flows. So we went to the approved costing guidance, we read all of the rules that are relevant to our trust, and we basically transposed them into one long, massive SQL statement that I think I pasted it into Word at one point, and it was something north of 40 pages. Not the prettiest solution. But what we then start to think about is actually we could use this VBA kind of development as the shell in which to run it in. So that became what we then started to look at. And if we then put it into this VBA package, could we then start to share it? Can we expand the scope that it's not just looking at the national cost collection, but actually when we're doing our quarterly runs, we can start to do validations on that as well. The ways that we're looking to use this tool at the minute is that before we actually get our data from our data engineering colleagues and we even touch our cost model, we are wanting to give them a report back that says these are all the data quality issues. So we can have a preloading of checks, data quality checks. We can have an in-process checks. And when we come to say we're happy with the model, or are we happy with the model before we publish, can we have a look at running some validations on that as well? If we're using this VBA development and we're looking to standardize it, if we could create this little shell, this little box that we could hand to any other trust in the country, and with minor tweaking, they can get it running on their end as well, then that would be fantastic. It means that not just would it be a solution for us, but it'd also be a solution for other trusts around the country as well, potentially in the same position as us. But even if your software supplier does run some of those checks, I am aware that some of those checks are just on, say, the first month's file. So it won't pick up any subsequent months' errors. So again, it's just something that might then be useful. And we also wanted that if we're giving you this box that runs all these checks in, why don't we make it open source so that we don't have any our kind of emergency department, we don't have community services. But actually, if we hand over this box and you guys could write some of those, if you're in costing land, then fantastic, we can all contribute to it. And also, I've spoken before that there are colleagues that have blown me out of the water in Excel. There are certainly colleagues that will blow me out of the water in SQL. So the more coverage, the more eyes, somebody might be able to tell me a better way of doing it, a more efficient way of doing it. And again, the national tool is fantastic for the NCC or the national cost collection, but a national tool doesn't exist, and there isn't a standardized tool for any kind of local checks. So potentially this could start to go down that route. So now over to the showtime bit. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. This is our engine. A lot of this you'll see similarities with the later showing as well, but essentially we've got an Excel file that does a bit of information, an introduction, what is the tool doing, a little bit around if I said about that community-led open box, open source. If people want to contribute, we're giving you an email address that you can contribute your rules through. A bit of a disclaimer that this is an interpretation of the national engine. The reality is we don't know what the exact scripture is that the national rules runs, but this is what we've inferred from the descriptions. A bit of an essential setup. You need to input your server name and you need a database name. You need to have access to SQL Server. We can then perform a test that checks that actually a little ping tech. Can we connect to that server? Can we actually proceed with this? If I've misspelt something, and what's going to happen is I'm going to get an error message that basically says I can't connect. There's only 2 cells that are populated, so I can then investigate why that is. We then tried to create little batches of rules. Run all tabs will basically go through source, every single tab, and run every bit of information that's executable on those tabs. You can equally do source, NCC, DVE rules if you were, say, doing just the national cost collection, or if you were doing a local model and you've written local rules, you can do obviously that source and local rules, as well as individual tabs on this front page. We wanted it to be quite transparent, so we've tried to add frequently asked questions and instructions as we go in the actual document. But if you have downloaded this tool from the Innovation Forum, then it does come preloaded with a bunch of files in the background as well as process notes. The source tabs where it starts to get a little bit more ugly, but essentially we've got a bit of dialogue around what you're actually trying to do in a description of that. It's this SQL column that's the most important part. What it's going to do is within this cell for this individual column, there is a whole bunch of SQL. I could copy and paste this into SQL Server Management Studio, execute it, and it will run. What this will do is by putting them into the cells, it's going to sequentially step through each of these and execute each individual SQL cell. There's nothing particularly fancy in here. There's a bit of a drop, a table, create the table environment, and then bulk insert the actual context, the actual information you want to put in there. Most of this is things that are publicly available on the approved costing guidance that say feed type, for example. If you go into the DV rules, there is a table on there that says feed type, what is the permissible values, and what is the description. Essentially, when you're doing your national cost collection, are you submitting files that it would expect to receive? If it's not within that list, chances are you've got something wrong, or you're trying to submit something you shouldn't be trying to submit. So it just runs those checks. This is the pre-requirements, the what are we going to perform our check against. The next stage is that we now need to, we've got what we're going to check against. We now need the actual content we're going to check, which would be the national cost collection files. Like I said, we wanted it to be something that everybody has. NHS England mandates that the collection of the national cost collection means that there are certain files that need to be collected at a single point in time. So we've created the wrapper for these. The int rec, this is what the columns should look like. They should have a maximum of 5 columns for the org submitted ID. We've got the wrapper. So now we need to populate what is contained in that wrapper. And we're given 2 options here. The first option is if your data exists in SQL Server already, great, pull it across, do a simple insert statement, and great, you're off to the races. If you're a trust that you don't have that information, maybe your software supplier provides you your CSVs, or there is a complex tool that extracts them, then what we've done is you can import the file location of those relevant files, and it will use, going back to the previous source bit, a bulk insert statement that will basically take that data, load it into that data set, that table, ready for you to then apply those rules against. So we've got our source information, we've got the tables that we actually want to check. We now just need a requirement. What are we actually going to check? This goes back to the approved costing guidance. And if I just open my SQL environment, what we end up having is that there is a rule. So DQ 1000, for example, should be a field format. It checks the length of the CDS unique identifier. There's a bit of information around what characters are allowed and a max length of 35. It also tells me which fields need to be checked, whether it's submission failure or warning. And then we've added these columns on the end as to how do we actually check that relevant rule, what are the number of failing rows, and what is the cost that has failed. So within each of these, going back to that CDS unique ID, I'll just go a little bit through the SQL for that. We've got a little bit of a variable to set the DQ number. We're going to push some information to a log. The log's there so that you can see, has that process taken place? How long has it taken? The time taken is useful because if you write a really inefficient bit of script and it's taken 12 hours to run, then it might be something you want to investigate to improve. It's mainly this section here, this with CTE. This is where the check is being performed, and it's looking for a length of, say, greater than 35 characters. Once it's found those records, it pushes them into a repository and it closes up the log. I don't want to go too much into this because the SQL, it can get a bit more complicated. But whilst I'm at this junction, and I'll just get everybody back on screen so it has disappeared, can I get a show of hands? Who would be a little bit kind of nervous of the script, who doesn't understand SQL, who, even if they do know SQL, this is getting a little bit much. Can you just put your hands up? There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying you don't know SQL in this. Yep. Okay. Well, so I am very cognizant that my team are very SQL based. We are very proficient with SQL, and therefore this to us we can really understand it. But what the power of this information is that actually we can deviate from the SQL. We've got tools now that can help us with this. So even if you don't use SQL in your line of work, it's not something you use on a regular basis, there are ways that you can still download this tool and you can still make things better on it. So if I just go back onto here, I picked out a rule to test this on, and I picked rule 1400. Essentially, the distinct count of activity records must equal the value recorded in the number of activities field. Probably means very little to you, but there's this little Y in the EC column. We don't do emergency care, therefore we won't have written this rule for emergency care. What I can choose to do is I can actually put this information into Copilot. So if I just get Copilot up, and I'll talk you through what I've written. I need some help writing an SQL query to check the following requirements. That's the requirement that I copied from that data that I was showing you a second ago. And I just want to check, yes, it was on that screen, so that's good. The table design is as follows. I've just basically told them what are the column names and what are the requirements. So length of, say, 5, length of 10. What are the parameters for that column? I've then also said the check must be like the following. Hint, the DQ number is 1400. And I've just taken a copy of 1200's rule and just pasted it in. I've not done anything else. I don't actually know what 1200 is at this moment in time. Copilot is now going, great, there's some information here, but hopefully this bit looks somewhat familiar to what I had up on screen in the formula bar. They've now written DQ 1400 for me. And they've done some rationale, which hopefully means that I now can check that rule. And it assumes at ID is the unique identifier, the having clause, yada, 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 there's a whole bunch of information there. But if I don't know SQL, I can now use, with plain English and prompts, AI, to make sure that this tool gives coverage. If you're a community trust, or if you're wanting to use this tool in the other applications that I'm going to talk about later, but you don't know SQL, that doesn't mean you can't use this. It will still potentially be useful to you, and you can use plain English to get Copilot to write it for you. So we've got our national rules, and I spoke before about the fact that I wanted it to also be open for you to do whatever you wanted to do with it. If you wanted to check pre-costing data, you wanted it to do kind of your processing or even your outputs, and you write rules, whether that is standard deviation of cost drivers, whether that is you want to highlight the patients that are more than 50 or 100,000 pounds for you to sense check why they are and are they correct? Is it an error with a driver? Whatever. You could write that into here. And even if you don't know that, going back to Copilot is an opportunity for you to then do that. I just wanted to give another demonstration here. Another little bit of text to put into Copilot. I'll just paste that in. So I'm going to put fantastic, great job. Now can you write me a rule that would check for records where the start date and end date are greater than 1 day of each other? And whilst we're at it, I might have some data quality. I might have start date and end date that isn't actually a date. or isn't populated. So let's check that too. So it's still going to check my table for emergency care because realistically wanted to say, have they been in emergency care for several days? Have they been in theatre for a year? Let's look for those. This might be a rule that exists in the national rule base, but actually you could, if it doesn't exist, you can still write this. Certainly, has a patient been in theatre for several years isn't a national rule, but you could turn it into a local rule that you could check if that's relevant, potentially useful to you. And again, it's just spat out the SQL for me. In a lot of cases, I can just copy that and try and run it. Does it do what I wanted it to do? I don't necessarily need to know SQL for this. Because it's preloaded, because it's come with this context of what's been done historically, it can use that to inform how it works in the future. And going back to if it'll let me go back to it, I need to full screen it. Going back to the presentation, the tool is hugely versatile. It is a glorified ETL. It doesn't necessarily do the extracting, but that's what Power Query is for. You can create a connection to SQL Server and extract that way. It is a transform and load tool. So I applied it to a costing use case in this example, but you can use it for whatever you wanted. In the local rules that were up on screen a second ago, what we had chosen to do and the scripts that were written there essentially took our NCC files and transformed them into an aggregated data set that we could potentially share with some of our peer trusts. So we can get a jump on the fact that 24-25 data has not been published. We could start sharing aggregated data sets so we can look at unit cost. We can kind of mirror that Plix portal kind of data set. We can look at differences in length of stay in theatre minutes against peer trusts without necessarily needing to have, going back to the Plix portal, a set of pre-required filters that we're already looking at. We can make that generic, look at everything, and that might hone where we target. You can essentially do whatever you want with it. The only thing, and this was carried over from a previous slide deck, was it's limited by your ability in SQL. I would argue now it's not limited by your ability in SQL. It's limited by your ability to conceptualize what next. If you wanted to use that local rules for anything transformational, you could do. You have complete flexibility around that now. It is a form of pseudo RPA. I spoke about the fact that we're hoping to share some of our kind of aggregated data sets with some peer trusts. This is going through a step-based approach to take our data set, to clean it, to do some transformation on it, to spit out an output that we could actually share and is aggregated, pseudonymizes, low record counts, whatever. It can be an extra level of assurance. For us, it took us 40 minutes at national cost collection period to run this tool, whereas the national tool's taken us up to a day to get an output from. So this could give us an indication of where to look earlier and save us that time. And almost being a used car salesman, there is absolutely nothing stopping you writing 600 rules for your local validations. And when you come to publish your internal models, your quarterly models, going, well, I've got assurance that it's correct because I've already applied 600 different rules to check that it's fit for purpose. You can use it for a lot of those kind of use cases. But the other part of my presentation, and anybody that didn't work in costing, this is where hopefully it'll be a bit more exciting to yourselves, is it's this other applications and the future use with AI. So this tool was built on a little script from VBA, a little bit of VBA coding that enabled us to run SQL from Excel. The previous use case was that we wanted to look exclusively at costing. We wanted to validate our outputs, and make sure it's all fit for purpose and all of that. What we can also do is use this for whatever we like. In this case, we've created a variance analysis engine. So in this case, I'm looking at financial management. How can this tool benefit financial management? And what the conceptual idea is that similar to costing, we're running a rules-based approach to identify potential errors. We could use the same logic to look at month-end close down. What are the variances? Is there a chance for error to have been, error or omission, I should know, to have taken place? Same principle, let's get our environment set up and test the connection. But this time, instead of it being specific batches, this runs everything at once. And there's a bit more of a control arm to this that I'll show in a second. But essentially, clicking process will start running the entire software. Again, try to keep it quite open and transparent. So a bit of coverage and talking about different things, as well as some frequently asked questions again. But that kind of controller, that business kind of controller element is this process list. Again, we've got some narrative, including what the actual step is and whether we actually want to run it. So in this case, I've said, I want to set some parameters. I want to extract some data from the ledger. I want to create a whole plethora of profiles, build some validation repositories, do the variance analysis, potentially have a look at forecasting. And then actually, if we've done our variance analysis and we're happy with the output, then actually some of those profiles we can now actually use in forecasting themselves. So we can not only do a rules-based approach to variance analysis, but now we're also going down the arm of a rules-based approach to forecasting. Again, all just toggling, do I want to run it or not? I'm just going to talk about kind of the profiles and the variance and validation bit now. Profiles themselves. What we've tried to do is, again, just looking at that SQL command bit and I guess a little bit this column D action description. From the data that I've loaded, let's kind of parse it up into little chunks. So I want to have a table that's looking at current month. I want a table that's my year to date. I want a table that's looking at the previous month, maybe the last 3 months average, last 6 months, whatever else. We can then start to think, how can we start to use this as a comparator? If I'm talking of pay, potentially smoothing the last 3 months that somebody got paid will normalize the fact that they might have had on overtime, they might have had enhancements. Their pay hopefully stayed roughly consistent, their basic pay element. And I might be able to use that then to say, well, is it consistent with that? Have we been paying someone for the last 3 months that actually we've not paid this month? It opens up that kind of, have they left the trust? If they have, great, that's answer closed. If they haven't, well, what on earth happened that we're no longer paying them? Have they moved roles? Have they changed assignment? What's happened? Is some investigation required following that? But essentially, let's create a whole plethora of profiles. And I also want to kind of pause here and just say that using this, again, this is very SQL heavy, but there's absolutely nothing stopping us using AI to help us with this. And I'll just flip back over here and I've created another prompt that I wanted AI to look at. I'm confident in my ability to create a table that does year to date, that does last 3 months, whatever. I'm possibly happy that I could do seasonality, but it's getting a little bit more complicated. I might not even be confident I could do any of those tables to begin with. So let's use plain English and say, I'm struggling to write a profile, this case seasonality. I want to use the prior year's data to create a percentage profile that would model the in-month peak and troughs. Again, I've given an example rule. We don't need to understand this because it's just SQL, it's preloaded SQL. I can run that. And what it's going to do is it's going to create those rules for me. So each of these, that would be a cell. That might be a cell. And then the main meat of it, I'm creating my seasonality profile, and that's the SQL script that it's going to create for me. It tells me what it gives me. It tells me how to use it. That can be some useful information for me. But essentially, I don't need to know the logic of how to do this. I can pass it to that to do it for me. And maybe I can, take it a little bit further. I can keep it going. Well, 1 year might be great, but actually, can you do the year before as well and normalize the outputs over 2 years? There might be something that took place in 1 year that is not representative and is only representative of that individual year. So what it's going to do now is build me the next one, or this time normalized for that period. I can also say, great, fantastic, we can take this further. And I'll just move on to the next tab into that area. This one, the variance and validations, is now going, let's check the data against some of these profiles. So I've got some rules here that say I want to look for a substantial absolute variance in month. I want to look for them year to date. I want to check that, is it a substantial absolute variance in budget, in forecast, in run rate? If it's all of the above, then it's going to be more significant to me than if it's just in one of them. Is the percentage significant? Is it value significance? Is it both? Is it a statistical outlier and using standard deviation? Is there a signage mismatch? This is where I'm starting to check the profiles against the actual data. And again, going back to AI, I can paste in a little bit of script in here. And now this time I'm saying, imagine you're a statistician and an accountant at the same time, looking for statistically likely errors in actuals. Draft me some rules to highlight areas for investigation. Now this might spit out things that are a bit overkill, and it's going to look for unusual month-on-month trends. We've kind of got something like that already. Outlier detection using Z-scores, standard deviation, I built that in already. I've done seasonality profile and zero budgets and stuff. So it's given me some good ideas, but actually, I'm not a statistician. This is very much down the accountancy route. I'm quite happy that I might have conceptualized some of these. I might not have written them, and it might have given me the answer to copy and paste those into the actual data set and run with it. Great. But if I'm also a little bit honest, I'm a little bit underwhelmed. So I'm saying, come on, let's get a bit more statistical. And this is the bit that's going to completely blow me out of the water. We have done Z-scores, but we've certainly not done coefficient of variance spike. I've not done interquartile range outlier. I'll be honest, some of this is now starting to go above my head. I don't actually know what half of this is, but this is the various different ways that I could start to be more thorough in how I'm looking at variances. So whether this is applicable to costing, whether it's applicable to the fact that you've downloaded this future tool, I can't tell you when it's going to be published. It's still just being ratified by our internal group, but essentially this ETL will become available. So you could use it for whatever you want to do. If you wanted to ask it to bake in Python into that, great, it can do. It's an open box for you to do whatever you want with. That, like going back to my previous slides, the limitation is what you can conceptualize. So I can copy and paste these now back into my data set, and I can run the individual rules. And it will then flow and spit me out an output. I'm just going to go back here and prove that it does actually work. I didn't want to run this earlier because it does lock up my computer for a little bit of time. I'll run something that runs quite quickly, but it's just to show how it would run and what running looks like. And essentially, run create source data steps. It's going to go at the bottom. It's going to say what it's doing and what percentage it's at. And this is going to go through those loops and go through each line of that. If I just go on to my log, which is spat out into the SQL environment I've specified, what I can do is I can see that it's running, and I can see it's now up to 24 of that rule. I can rerun it. I'm now up to 31, and it's sequentially going through each of those, and it's giving me timestamps of them running. So whilst that's running, I just wanted to kind of go back to the fact that we've got this environment where we've written SQL statements that are being executed, whether we've written them, whether AI's written them. We've got a rules-based approach to whatever it is you're doing. This is where it starts to get a little bit more exciting for me, is that obviously the world's going in favor of AI, and there's a lot more things that AI is going to start picking up and doing. Whereas before, when I started my presentation, I mentioned that our trust doesn't allow us to use Power Automate. So if I'm wanting to automate something, that's not even an option for me to use. So we've almost been forced down this SQL route, partly because I've conceptualized it, I can do it, that's something we now have available to us so that we can progress with. We could equally buy a tool that does an ETL process. But what I really like about this approach, and it's possibly my own bias, is that it's rule-based. So where we've copied bits of the scripts and we put them into Copilot and said, use this as an example, when we're starting to talk about AI agents, which is similar to when I said act as an accountant and as a statistician, what AI agents will do is we tell them the task and we give them something to learn from. So if you want it to write you a report based on some data, you give it the data, it understands it, it goes through a whole logical sequence, it takes a period of time, but eventually it spits out an output, a report that you could take to any environment that you see fit. This to me is very powerful in the fact that we've got the learning content for it to learn from. If in the future financial management no longer need to do variance analysis, they no longer need to do forecasting, costing no longer needs to do data quality checks, what I can do is I can hand this document to that agent with the narrative of pretend you're an accountant, a statistician, and a jack of all trades and whatever else, and it will read what has been done historically, what are the rules that have been written, and then actually apply them and take them further. So as I showed before, that it suggested things that had already been, that I was already confident I could do. When we then started going down this really statistical route, that blew me out of the water. That's the potential for it to take what I've done and go that next stage deeper. So I'm going to stop there for questions. Also, just going back to this, it's run all the way through. Hopefully, if I now go here and execute, I end up with, there's now 100 records that have been written. So great, that's all run all the way through. So the tool does work. If you have used the TCVE tool before, fantastic. Happy to take questions on it here. Happy to take questions via the email that we've shared on there. But equally, when we get to sharing this ETL, the underlying principle, that which this variance analysis tool has been built on, also happy and very much would be excited to see what you could do with it, because the costing world, we've made that so it's plug and play. I can give that to any trust in the country, and largely, as long as I'm updating the server name, the database name, and where they've saved their files, then you can crack on and use that in any trust. Things like the variance analysis tool will be more subjective and based on our ledger structure, but there's certainly things we could learn from each other and how you've chosen to use it. You could use it to load data, to just, even before you use your costing software, you can use it in that capacity as an ETL to load data and to clean it and whatnot prior to costing use. The possibilities are what you can conceptualize. So I will stop there. Hand over for questions. I don't think I've got anything left on my slide deck. I'll just check. No, it is just questions. So I'll reshare that. Yep, all done.
Can you see the chat on the side, Michael? Do you want to read it out?
Can you read it out?
Yeah, of
I've
course.
got limited windows available.
Yeah, no problem. So it says, hi, from Natasha. Am I right in understanding you currently use the costing version of this tool against your draft submission files before you submit them to the DVE, not against the source activity data feeds you get from health informatics before you upload them into your costing system? And then followed by, could you also show an example of the output of running this tool? Is it SQL table that lists all of the rules that have failed and where/why?
Yes, the last bit first. It does output SQL tables, and it does list. It lists one, the failing patient in the detailed tab. It lists the rules that have been run potentially to show that this is where it's got stuck at and stopped. And it also outputs, so each DQ number, I think I shared before, and I'll bring it back up on screen to be fair as well. It would tell me that 1337, for example, the check has been performed, and I'd expect either a Y or an N in that column, and then the count of rows. If it's got a count of rows or a sum of cost, that means it has failed that check. So what we chose to do at NCC time was we had a Power Query connection that looked at this table, and it basically had a little pivot table that showed us all the submission failures and all the warnings, and just that element of the submission. So hopefully that answers the last bit of it. The first part of the question about does it just look at our NCC files, the part of the tool which is just doing the national cost collection, the DVE rules, does. Your local rules can do anything in the world. So this is where the local rules is where we're writing to look at our source files from what would be your health informatics colleagues, which would be our data engineering colleagues. We're running a batch of commands right there before we start doing any modeling. So if we're talking NCC timeline, on the first 7 days after April's complete, after March is complete, we're able to run that data quality check from this tool potentially, and that would give us our report back to our data engineering colleagues. That means that whilst they're working on that, we're only 7 days into the month. We can be cracking on with modeling, but we know that we've highlighted a lot of the errors that are going to cause us problems in the future. So instead of getting to the end and seeing you've got a £10 million patient because they've been in theatre for 10 years, that's likely a data quality issue. So we know that that's been underway and there's a ticketed system for resolving that. So partly, yes, just national cost collections, but local rules, you can do what you want with. They don't have to look at NCC outputs. You could change the database environment so that it's looking at anything whatsoever. Okay.
I can just see someone's typing, so I'm just going to give them a little minute. So if my software generates CSV files and I want to check them using your tool, do I need to import those CSV files into SQL database first before using your tool?
No, you can leave them as CSV files, and as part of the load NCC file tab, you can actually specify the file directory of that. So that would be computer, group share, whatever, user, costing, month one file. You could load all 12 months into there. The only caveat being is that you need sufficient permissions on your SQL environment to be able to run bulk insert statements. I know that there are a handful of trusts that I've spoken to that they are not, despite the fact they own that server in that team, they've not been trusted enough to have that level of permissions, but you can request it and it will then run.
And Natasha said again, in the future, once you're ready to share this tool, where will we be able to access it? Future NHS.
Yeah, so the Simplicity, the Christie validation engine is already available. That's on the One Innovation Finance Forum. That's an innovation that's been submitted and accepted. So you can download that today if you want. The ETL tool that we've used to build this variance analysis piece on is complete. It's just going through, we have like an internal ratification process that basically make sure that we've filled in all the boxes correctly, that it's fit for other people's uses, not just ours. So there's a little bit more combing through it, but it's just subject to them saying that they're happy with it fundamentally, and then it'll be submitted. And again, if anybody does use this, I would please ask that you do come back to us and let us know how you're using it, because the more ways we can use things like this, the better. In our trust, we've got a costing version of it. We've got the variance analysis, and we're using it to transpose our drugs data. So we can split out the ledger by patient identifiable, non-patient identifiable ward stock, for example.
I've just pasted the innovation into the chat as well, if anyone needed it. Doesn't seem to be any other questions coming through on the meeting chat. Oh, just saying a thank you. Yep, all good. Fab. So yeah, I will post this onto the innovation page once it's uploaded onto our YouTube page as well. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.